Marcus had always prided himself on noticing details that others overlooked. Maybe it came from years of amateur astronomy, training his eyes to spot the faintest stars against the vast darkness. Or perhaps it was simply his nature to observe and analyze. Whatever the reason, when the new student entered Professor Williams' advanced physics classroom that crisp September morning, every instinct told him something was different about her. While other students shuffled in with their usual Monday morning lethargy, checking phones and grabbing coffee-stained seats, she moved with deliberate precision. Her dark eyes swept the lecture hall methodically, lingering on details most people ignored: the arrangement of windows, the hum of ventilation systems, even the way dust particles danced in the morning sunlight streaming through tall panes of glass. She was striking, with copper-tinted hair that seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent lights, and skin so pale it looked like she'd never spent time outdoors. But what captured Marcus's attention most were her eyes, an unusual amber color that seemed almost luminescent when the light hit them just right. "That's the new transfer student," whispered Tyler, his lab partner, following Marcus's gaze. "Name's Nova. Pretty weird if you ask me. Yesterday she asked me what building this was, even though there's a massive sign right outside the entrance." Marcus shrugged, but found his attention drifting to her throughout Professor Williams' lecture on gravitational waves. While most students either scribbled notes frantically or fought to stay awake, Nova sat completely motionless, absorbing every word with an intensity that bordered on unsettling. She never looked away from the professor, never checked her phone, never even shifted in her seat. After class, as students filed out in their typical rush to grab lunch, Nova remained seated, staring at the equations Professor Williams had left. On the whiteboard, she appeared so absorbed that Marcus wondered if she'd forgotten where she was. Fascinating stuff, right? Marcus ventured, approaching her row with his backpack slung over one shoulder. She turned toward him, and up close, those amber eyes were even more striking. She replied, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't identify.
That's
Informative. There was something peculiar about her word choice. Most students would say cool or interesting or complain about how complicated it was. Formative seemed oddly formal, like she was selecting each word with careful consideration. "You're Nova, right? I'm Marcus. I noticed you're new here."
yes.
"I am ... adapting," she said, standing gracefully. Marcus noticed she wore only a thin cardigan, despite the fact that autumn had arrived early, bringing unseasonably cold weather. Everyone else was bundled in jackets and hoodies, but she seemed entirely unbothered. "Aren't you freezing?" he asked, genuinely concerned. "It's pretty cold today." For just a moment, something flickered across her features. Surprise, perhaps. Confusion. No. Then she wrapped her arms around herself in what looked like a remembered gesture. "Oh yes, very cold. I am not accustomed to this climate." But Marcus had spent enough time outdoors to recognize genuine cold responses. When people were truly cold, their breathing changed, their posture shifted naturally, their movements became sharper. Nova's shivering looked almost rehearsed, like she was remembering how to perform it rather than actually experiencing it. "Where are you from?" Marcus asked, as they walked toward the exit together. "Far away," she answered, which wasn't really an answer at all. "A small place. You probably have not heard of it." Over the following days, Marcus kept encountering Nova around campus. She seemed to appear everywhere: the library, the student center, even the physics building's rooftop observatory, where Marcus often went to escape crowds. Each time she was watching people, studying their interactions with the focused intensity of a researcher. When he suggested they studied together for their upcoming exam, she agreed immediately, her amber eyes lighting up with what seemed like genuine excitement. They met Thursday evening at the library's quietest corner. Marcus arrived to find Nova surrounded by textbooks, but she wasn't really reading them. Instead, she was observing other students, a group cramming for midterms. Friends sharing earbuds, couples whispering intimately. "Find something interesting?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Humans are complex," she said, then quickly corrected herself. "I mean, people here are different from where I come from. Very social," as they've studied Marcus. Found himself watching Nova, more than his physics notes. She sat with perfect posture, never slouching or fidgeting like other students. When she read, her lips moved slightly, as if sounding out unfamiliar concepts. Every few minutes, she would glance at him, with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, analytical, almost scientific. About an hour into their session, she began that familiar shivering routine. "It's so cold in here," she said, rubbing her arms dramatically. "Would it be acceptable if I sat closer for warmth?" Marcus looked around the library. The temperature was comfortable. Other students wore t-shirts and light sweaters. But Nova looked genuinely distressed, so he gestured to the chair beside him. When she moved closer, he caught a strange scent, not perfume or shampoo, but something clean and otherworldly like the air before a lightning storm. And when her arm brushed against his as they shared the textbook, her skin felt perfectly warm. "Not cold at all. Better?" he asked softly. "Much better," she replied, and for the first time since meeting her, Nova smiled genuinely. Right. It transformed her entire face, making her seem less mysterious and more human. They spent the next 2 hours studying side by side, but Nova's questions were unlike anything Marcus had ever heard. She didn't ask about formulas or theories, but about fundamental concepts any college student should understand. Why did humans choose to study space when they lived on a planet? What drove people to form emotional connections? Why did Marcus prefer observing stars to socializing? "I guess I've always felt like there was something more out there," Marcus explained, pointing to a diagram of distant galaxies. "Like we're not alone in the universe. Doesn't it seem impossible that Earth is the only planet with life?" Nova was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What would you do if you discovered life existed somewhere else?" "I'd want to understand it," Marcus said without hesitation. "Learn about it, maybe even communicate if possible. Wouldn't that be incredible to meet someone from another world?" Something unreadable passed across Nova's face. She looked down at the textbook, then back at him with an expression that seemed almost sad. "Yes," she said quietly. "It would be incredible." When the library announced closing time, they packed up together. Outside, the autumn air carried a genuine chill, and Marcus pulled on his jacket. Nova, still in her thin cardigan, wrapped her arms around herself again. "Here," Marcus said, starting to remove his jacket. "You can borrow this." "Oh, I could not. I've got a hoodie underneath." "Really?" He draped the jacket over her shoulders, and she pulled it close around herself. Instead of looking grateful or relieved, she seemed fascinated by the garment itself, running her fingers over the zipper, examining the fabric, studying how the sleeves hung on her small frame. "Thank you," she said finally. "This is very kind." And that careful word choice. Most people would say nice or sweet. But as they walked across campus together, Marcus found himself wondering if Nova was studying him just as intently as he was studying her. When they reached the dormitories, Nova started to remove his jacket. "Keep it tonight," Marcus said impulsively. "You can give it back tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" she asked, and something hopeful flickered in her amber eyes. "We could study again. Maybe grab coffee first." Her smile was radiant. "I would like that very much." As Marcus walked back to his own dorm, his mind raced with questions. Everything about Nova felt like a puzzle with missing pieces: her formal speech patterns, her intense fascination with ordinary human behavior, her strange relationship with temperature, and most puzzling of all, the way she seemed to be conducting some kind of invisible research on everyone around her. What he didn't know was that across campus, Nova sat in her dorm room still wearing his jacket, running her fingers over the fabric and trying to understand why something as simple as human kindness could feel so overwhelming. She had observations to make, data to collect, a mission to complete. But for the first time since arriving on Earth, she found herself wanting to understand something that had nothing to do with her assignment. She wanted to understand Marcus, and that realization both thrilled and terrified her in ways she hadn't expected. 3 weeks had passed since that first study session, and Marcus found himself completely captivated by Nova in ways he couldn't explain. They had settled into a comfortable routine: coffee before Tuesday and Thursday classes, evening study, sessions and long walks across campus when the weather was pleasant. Well, when the weather was pleasant for everyone else, Nova seemed to find every day unbearably cold. It had become almost amusing how frequently she claimed to be freezing. Just yesterday, they'd been sitting in the student union with the heating system working overtime. The temperature was so warm that Marcus had rolled up his sleeves and was considering stepping outside for fresh air. But Nova, bundled in a thick sweater and scarf, had started her familiar routine. "I'm absolutely freezing," she had said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Could I sit closer to you?" Marcus had glanced at other students lounging comfortably, in t-shirts and light clothing, but he'd scooted over anyway. The moment Nova pressed against his side, she'd sighed contentedly, as if his proximity had somehow solved her temperature problem. Tonight was different, though. They were sitting on the roof of the physics building, sharing access to the department's powerful telescope. Dr. Reeves, the observatory director, had given Marcus's special permission to use the equipment for his independent study project. It was actually a mild evening for October, barely a breeze stirring the air. Predictably, Nova had claimed to be cold within minutes of arriving. "The stars look so different from here," she said quietly, and something in her voice made Marcus look away from the telescope's eyepiece. "Different from where?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, staring up at the constellation Andromeda with an expression he'd never seen before. "From home, where I grew up, we couldn't see them as clearly." Marcus waited, hoping she would elaborate. In all their time together, Nova had never really discussed her background. She deflected questions about her family, her childhood, even basic details about her hometown. It was as if she'd appeared in his life fully formed, with no past to speak of. "What was it like?" he asked gently. "Where you're from." Nova pulled their shared blanket tighter around herself, despite the pleasant temperature. "Very different from here. Quieter, less ... populated. You miss it?" Another long pause. "Sometimes, but not as much as I expected." They sat in comfortable silence, taking turns with the telescope. Marcus was adjusting the focus on Jupiter when Nova made a soft sound of surprise. He looked up to see meteors beginning to streak across the sky above them. "Perseid shower?" Marcus said excitedly. "I forgot it was peaking tonight. This is perfect timing." But when he looked at Nova, she wasn't watching the meteors with wonder, like most people would. She was staring at them with an expression of pure longing, her amber eyes filling with tears that caught the starlight. "Hey," Marcus said, concerned. "Are you okay?" She wiped her eyes quickly. "Yes, sorry. They're just beautiful." As more meteors blazed across the sky, Marcus heard her whisper something under her breath. The sounds were musical, almost like singing, but completely foreign. The syllables flowed together in patterns that seemed impossible for human vocal cords to produce. "What was that?" he asked softly. Nova looked startled, like she hadn't realized she was speaking aloud. "Oh, nothing. It's just something from home. A poem about stars." Marcus wanted to ask more, but something in her expression stopped him. She looked vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before, like she was fighting some internal battle between what she wanted to say and what she felt she could reveal. They watched the meteor shower in relative silence after that, but Marcus's mind was racing. He'd started keeping a mental catalog of Nova's peculiarities, and the list was growing longer every day. There was her apparent inability to judge temperature accurately. Last week, the campus had experienced an unusually warm day to 75 degrees in late October. While other students wore shorts and t-shirts, Nova had arrived at their study session in a winter coat, claiming the weather was absolutely frigid. There was her fascination with mundane human activities. She watched people eat with intense curiosity, asking detailed questions about food preferences and meal rituals. She'd spent an entire afternoon observing students in the cafeteria, taking mental notes on social hierarchies and interaction patterns. Most puzzling was her knowledge of astronomy that seemed to go far beyond textbook learning. During their telescope sessions, she described distant star systems with vivid detail that sounded less like academic study and more like personal memory. When Marcus mentioned the possibility of life around Proxima Centauri, Nova had nodded knowingly, then caught herself and claimed she'd read about it in a research paper. Nova, Marcus said carefully as they packed up the telescope equipment. Can I ask you something that might sound strange? Of course. Are you really from another country? 'Cause sometimes it feels like you're from... He paused, realizing how ridiculous it would sound. Somewhere much farther away. For a moment, Nova went completely still. In the dim light, her amber eyes seemed to glow with their own inner luminescence. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely audible. I mean, you ask questions about things that everyone knows. You describe space like you've been there. You speak languages I've never heard. And you seem to be studying human behavior like... He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Like what? Like you're not human yourself. The words hung in the air between them. Marcus immediately felt foolish for saying it, but Nova's reaction made his breath catch. Instead of laughing or looking confused, she stared at him with an expression of terror and something that looked almost like relief. That's impossible, she said finally. But her voice shook before Marcus could respond. A strange sound echoed across the campus below. Not quite music, not quite static, but something in between. Nova's head snapped up, tilting like she was listening to something he couldn't hear. The sound came again. This time Marcus noticed that the lights across campus flickered slightly. The observatory's equipment hummed, and his phone screen pulsed with interference. What was that? Marcus asked. But Nova wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring toward the horizon with an expression of panic and what looked disturbingly like guilt. I have to go, she said suddenly, standing so quickly that their shared blanket fell to the ground. What? Nova? What's wrong? Gathering her things, and Marcus could see her hands trembling. I'm sorry, she said, not meeting his eyes. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I never meant for this to become so complicated. For what to become complicated? Nova paused at the rooftop access door, her hand on the handle. For a moment, Marcus thought she was going to answer, to finally explain the growing mystery that surrounded her. But then she shook her head. Good night, Marcus, she whispered, and disappeared through the door before he could stop her. Marcus stood alone on the roof, surrounded by telescope equipment and the lingering scent of that strange, otherworldly fragrance that always seemed to follow Nova. The night air was warm, but he found himself shivering, not from cold, but from the growing certainty that his half-joking theory might not be so impossible after all. What he didn't know was that one floor below, Nova was standing in the stairwell, her hand pressed against the wall, fighting every instinct that told her to run back upstairs and tell him everything. The signal from home had been clear. Her mission timeline was accelerating. But Marcus's kindness, his growing suspicion, and her own inexplicable emotional responses were making everything far more complicated than her superiors had ever anticipated. She had come to Earth to study human behavior, to understand their culture and social structures. But somewhere along the way, she had started experiencing those very emotions herself, and that definitely wasn't part of the plan. The next few weeks brought a new intensity to Marcus and Nova's relationship, but with it came an escalation in the mystery surrounding her. Marcus had started paying closer attention to details, and what he discovered both fascinated and unsettled. There was the evening he'd brought her soup when she claimed to have caught a cold. He'd arrived at her dorm with homemade chicken broth and medicine, only to find that she showed no actual symptoms. No fever, no congestion, no fatigue, just a vague claim of illness that seemed to evaporate the moment he appeared with offers of care. There was the afternoon they'd studied in the campus greenhouse, surrounded by tropical plants and humid air that had other visitors peeling off jackets within minutes. While Marcus had been sweating in the oppressive heat, Nova had still insisted she was freezing, pressing close to him on a bench among the orchids and claiming she needed his warmth to concentrate. But the strangest incident had been 3 days ago at Blake's apartment. His roommate had invited them over for pizza and a movie night, and Marcus had been looking forward to seeing how Nova interacted in a more casual social setting. The evening had started normally enough. Blake, an engineering major with an easygoing personality, had welcomed Nova warmly and immediately cranked up the heat when she mentioned being cold. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner cafe had stopped by to drop off some leftover pastries. Nova had watched the casual interaction with that familiar, analytical intensity. "Your friend is interesting," Blake had whispered to Marcus while Nova was in the bathroom. "She asked me 15 questions about pizza toppings, like really detailed. Questions about why humans prefer certain flavor combinations and whether our choices reveal psychological patterns." But the truly bizarre moment had come during a brief power outage. The entire building had lost electricity for about 10 minutes, plunging them into darkness. While Marcus and Blake had fumbled for their phone flashlights, Nova had moved through the apartment with perfect confidence, as if she could see clearly in the pitch blackness. When Blake had commented on her excellent night vision, Nova had frozen mid-step. "I'm just familiar with this layout," she'd said quickly, though she'd only been in the apartment for an hour. Now, sitting in the Student Union Cafe on a Thursday afternoon, Marcus found himself studying Nova more closely than ever. She was drinking hot chocolate despite the fact that the cafe was warm enough that he'd removed his jacket. Her amber eyes were focused on a group of students at a nearby table, watching their animated conversation about weekend plans with the intensity of a scientist observing a new species. "Fascinating," she murmured under her breath. "What's fascinating?" Marcus asked. "The way they make decisions as a group. The social dynamics, the way they defer to the one with the strongest personality, the nonverbal communication."
I'll say she caught
herself and smiled apologetically. "Sorry, I'm just interested in sociology." Marcus nodded, but her word choice struck him as odd again. Not cool or funny, but fascinating. The kind of language researchers used when discussing subjects of study. "Nova," he said carefully. "Can I try something?" "Of course." Marcus reached across the small table and gently placed his hand on her arm. Through the thin fabric of her sweater, her skin felt exactly 98.6 degrees. Not warm, not cool, but precisely normal human body temperature. He moved his hand to her wrist, then to her shoulder. Everywhere he touched, her temperature was identical, as if her body maintained perfect thermal regulation regardless of external conditions. "You're not cold," he said quietly. Nova's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. Yes, I am. I'm always cold. Your skin is exactly the right temperature. It's never too hot or too cold, no matter what you're wearing or where we are. That's not how human physiology works." For a moment, Nova sat perfectly still. Then she wrapped her arms around herself in that familiar gesture. "I don't know what you mean. I just have poor circulation." Marcus was about to respond when Danny, the electronics store clerk from down the street, approached their table with a concerned expression. "Hey, are you guys having trouble with your phones?" Danny asked. "Mine's been acting weird for the past few minutes, getting interference, random signals." It started right around when, glanced at Nova, then back. At Marcus, actually. "Never mind. Sorry to bother you." As Danny walked away, Marcus noticed that his own phone was indeed showing strange behavior. The screen flickered occasionally, and when he checked his messages, there were brief moments of static interference. "That's odd," Marcus said, holding up his phone. Nova's face had gone pale. "Electronics can be unreliable," she said quickly. "Old building, lots of interference." But as Marcus looked around the cafe, he realized that other patrons weren't experiencing similar problems. Students at nearby tables were using their devices normally, with no signs of the electromagnetic disturbances affecting his phone. The interference seemed to be centered around their table, around Nova. "We should go," Nova said suddenly, standing. "And gathering her things, I have a ... appointment." Marcus wanted to protest, to ask more questions. But something in her expression, a mixture of panic and what looked almost like guilt, made him nod instead. As they walked across campus, Marcus's mind raced with new observations. The way Nova moved with perfect balance and coordination, never stumbling or showing fatigue, the way she never seemed to blink at normal intervals, her amber eyes staying focused for impossibly long periods, the way small electronics malfunctioned in her presence, creating interference patterns he'd never seen before. They stopped outside Nova's dormitory, and Marcus turned to face her. In the afternoon sunlight, her unusual eye color was even more pronounced. Not quite human amber, something more vibrant, almost luminescent. "Nova," he said softly, "I know you're hiding something from me, something big." She looked up at him with an expression so vulnerable and terrified that it broke his heart. "Marcus, ... whatever it is, you can trust me. I care about you, but I need to understand what's happening here." For a moment, it looked like she was going to tell him everything. Her mouth opened and Marcus held his breath, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would change everything between them. But then her phone buzzed with what sounded like an incoming message. Though the sound was unlike any notification tone Marcus had ever heard, more like a series of musical pulses than electronic beeps. Nova glanced at the device. Her face went completely white. "I have to go," she said, backing toward the dormitory entrance. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry." "Wait, Nova," but she was already disappearing through the glass doors, leaving Marcus standing alone on the sidewalk with more questions than ever, and the growing certainty that whatever Nova was hiding was far more extraordinary than he'd ever imagined. What Marcus didn't know was that in her dorm room, Nova was staring at a message that wasn't written in any Earth language. From superiors who were growing impatient with her extended timeline and concerned about her increasing emotional attachment to her human subject, the message was clear. Her observation period was ending soon, and she would need to make a choice between completing her mission or facing consequences that could affect not just her, potentially the human she'd grown to care about more than she'd ever thought possible. The electromagnetic disturbances around Nova were becoming impossible to ignore. Over the past week, Marcus had documented a pattern of electronic malfunctions that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Wi-Fi networks would briefly disconnect. When she entered buildings, digital clocks would display incorrect times in her presence. Even the campus's automated doors sometimes failed to respond properly when she approached them. Mrs. Park, the elderly neighbor who lived next to Nova's dormitory, had mentioned to Marcus that her television reception had been acting peculiar lately, picking up strange signals that sounded almost like music from another country. The interference was strongest in the evenings, around the time Nova typically returned from their study sessions. Marcus had started carrying a small digital recorder, ostensibly for class notes, but actually to capture the subtle electronic anomalies that occurred around Nova. The recordings revealed patterns of interference that seemed almost intentional, rhythmic pulses and frequency modulations that didn't match any known electronic signatures. Tonight, they were walking through the quiet section of campus near the engineering building when Akasa's phone began displaying the most severe interference yet. The screen flickered rapidly, showing brief glimpses of symbols that definitely weren't from any Earth language, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living text. "Nova, look at this," Marcus said, holding up his phone. But when he turned toward her, he found her standing perfectly still, her head tilted at an angle that seemed almost unnatural, as if she was listening to something he couldn't hear. "Do you hear that?" she asked quietly. Marcus strained his ears, but caught only the distant sound of traffic and the wind through the trees. "Hear what?" Nova's amber eyes were wide, reflecting the streetlights with an intensity that made them appear to glow. "Nothing. Just thought I heard music." But as they continued walking, Marcus noticed that Nova kept glancing at the sky, her expression growing increasingly anxious. When they passed under a particularly bright streetlight, he caught her murmuring something under her breath in that same musical language he'd heard during the meteor shower. "Nova, what are you saying?" She stopped walking abruptly. "Marcus, I need to tell you something important." His heart began racing. After weeks of mysteries and half-truths, was she finally going to explain everything? "The reason I always say I'm cold," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not because I actually feel cold." Marcus waited, sensing that this was just the beginning of something much larger. "I say it because... Because where I come from, we don't have casual physical contact. We don't touch the way humans do. So when I wanted to be close to you, to feel connected, I didn't know how to ask for it directly. So you pretended to need warmth." She nodded miserably. "It seemed like something humans would understand. A reason you would accept for wanting to be near someone. Marcus felt a mixture of tenderness and frustration. Nova, you never needed an excuse. If you wanted to be close to me, all you had to do was ask. Really? Really? But this isn't everything, is it? There's more you're not telling me. Before Nova could respond, every electronic device in their vicinity began malfunctioning simultaneously. Streetlights flickered in sequence, creating a wave of light and darkness that rippled down the entire block. Car alarms began sounding. In the distance, and Marcus's phone screen went completely white before displaying a stream of those impossible symbols. Nova was no longer looking at him. She was staring at the sky with an expression of absolute terror. They're early, she whispered. Who's early? Nova, what's happening? High above them, Marcus caught a glimpse of something that made his rational mind struggle to process what he was seeing. A light that wasn't quite a star, moving in patterns that defied conventional aircraft physics, growing steadily brighter. I have to go, Nova said, backing away from him. Right now. Marcus, I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to happen this way. Wait, Nova. Talk to me. But she was already running, moving with a speed and grace that seemed almost inhuman. Marcus chased after her, but she was impossibly fast. Disappearing around corners and through shadows, as if she knew exactly where to go, he found himself in the parking lot behind the physics building, breathing hard and completely alone. The electronic interference had stopped, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the gradual cessation of car alarms in the distance. Marcus pulled out his phone to call Nova, but the device was completely dead. Not powered off, not displaying a low battery warning, simply unresponsive, as if it had been subjected to some kind of electromagnetic pulse. As he stood there trying to understand what had just happened, Eddie, the campus night janitor, approached. With a concerned expression, "You see those lights too?" Eddie asked. Pointing toward the sky, Marcus looked up to see several points of light moving in coordinated patterns far above the campus. They weren't airplanes, their movements were. Too precise, too synchronized, and they made no sound despite their obvious proximity. What do you think they are? Marcus asked. Eddie shrugged. Been working here 30 years. Never seen anything like it. Started about an hour ago. Coincidence they showed up right when all the electronics went haywire. Marcus stared at the lights, and suddenly, everything began falling into place. Nova's impossible knowledge of astronomy, her formal way of speaking, as if English wasn't just foreign but entirely learned, her perfect temperature regulation and enhanced night vision, the electromagnetic interference that followed her everywhere, her reaction to meteors, as if they reminded her of home, her careful study of human behavior, as if she was conducting research, the way she'd looked at the sky tonight, not with wonder, but with recognition and fear. Eddie, Marcus said slowly, "What would you say if I told you I think those lights are here for someone specific?" The janitor studied the moving lights thoughtfully. "I'd say that someone's probably got some explaining to do." As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus's phone suddenly flickered back to life. But instead of his normal home screen, it displayed a single message in English, though the font was unlike anything he'd ever seen. "The observation period is concluding. Prepare for extraction." The message vanished after 3 seconds, leaving his phone functioning normally again. Marcus stared at the device, then back at the lights in the sky, and realized that whatever Nova had been hiding from him, it was far more extraordinary and complicated than he'd ever imagined. And from the looks of those coordinated lights above campus, her time for keeping secrets was rapidly running out. Tomorrow, he would have to find her and demand the complete truth. Because if his growing suspicions were correct, Nova wasn't just from another country or even another continent. She was from another world entirely, and something was calling her home. The electromagnetic chaos that engulfed the university the next morning was unlike anything Marcus had ever witnessed. Every electronic device on campus malfunctioned simultaneously. Computers crashed, fire alarms blared without cause, and the campus's central communication system broadcast nothing but a haunting musical static that seemed to pulse with intentional rhythm. Marcus had spent the sleepless night researching electromagnetic interference patterns, trying to understand what he'd experienced. but nothing in his physics textbooks explained signals that could selectively target electronics while leaving. Humans completely unaffected. He found Nova at their usual spot in the library, though she looked like she hadn't slept either. Her amber eyes were dimmed with exhaustion and something that looked like resignation. "We need to talk," Marcus said, sliding into the chair across from her. "I know." Her voice was barely audible above the cacophony of malfunctioning electronics. "Around them, Marcus, there are things I should have told you weeks ago." Before she could continue, the air around them began to shimmer slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Nova's phone, lying on the table between them, suddenly projected a three-dimensional hologram of what could only be described as the most beautiful and terrifying being Marcus had ever seen. The figure was humanoid, but distinctly not human, taller than any person, with features that seemed almost translucent and eyes that held the depth of starlight. When it spoke, the words came from Nova's phone, but in that same musical language Marcus had heard her whisper. "Nova," the being said, and somehow Marcus understood the meaning, despite the foreign words. "Your mission timeline has expired. Extraction protocols are now active," Nova responded in the same language, her voice tight with what sounded like argument or pleading. The conversation continued for several moments, while Marcus sat frozen, trying to process what he was witnessing. Finally, Nova switched to English. "Commander Vex, I need more time." The being's starlight eyes focused on Marcus with an intensity that made him feel like he was being analyzed down to the molecular level. "Your emotional compromise has been noted. This attachment was not part of your mission parameters. Not just an attachment," Nova said, and Marcus felt his heart skip at the fierce protectiveness in her voice. "His species is more complex than our initial assessments indicated. I need to complete my research." "Negative. The Council has reviewed your transmissions. Sufficient data has been gathered. You will return for debriefing and reassignment." Marcus found his voice at last. "Return where?" Nova looked at him with an expression of infinite sadness. "Home, which is ... very far from here." The holographic commander continued speaking. "Subject Marcus Martinez poses a security risk. His awareness of our operations violates first contact protocols. Memory adjustment will be necessary," Nova said sharply. "I won't allow that. It is not your decision, Observer Nova." Marcus's mind raced as he tried to understand the implications. "Memory adjustment means you're going to make me forget all of this. Forget Nova." The commander's attention shifted back to him. "You will retain memories of a transfer student who returned to her home country. All other experiences will be modified for accuracy." Nova stood up so abruptly that her chair fell backward. "Commander, I formally request asylum." The reaction from the hologram was immediate and severe. The projection flickered, and when it stabilized, Commander Vex's expression had transformed into something that transcended species barriers, pure, unmistakable fury. "You cannot be serious, Observer. You would abandon your people, your purpose, your very identity for this. Primitive emotional attachment. This primitive emotion is called love," Nova said steadily. "And yes, I would." Marcus felt the world shift around him, not just from the revelation that Nova was apparently an alien observer, but from her declaration of love spoken so simply and courageously in the face of what was clearly her superior officer. "Nova," he said softly. She turned to him, her amber eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm sorry I lied to you. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth from the beginning. I came here to study human behavior, to understand your species, social structures, and emotional responses. But I never expected to experience those emotions myself. Hey, you're really not from Earth. No. I'm from a world that orbits what you call Proxima Centauri. My people have been observing Earth for decades, trying to understand whether humans are ready for contact." Marcus absorbed this information, surprisingly calm given the circumstances. "And what did you conclude?" A small smile touched Nova's lips. "That humans are far more wonderful and complicated than we ever imagined. That your capacity for kindness, for connection, for love, is something my people have never experienced. And that maybe being primitive isn't such a terrible thing if it means being able to feel what I feel when I'm with you." The commander's hologram pulsed with increased intensity. "This is your final warning. Observer Nova. Report for extraction. Immediately, or face the consequences of abandoning your mission." Nova looked at Marcus, then back at the projection. "What if I refuse? Then you will be stripped of your rank, your citizenship, and your biological enhancements. You'll become fully human, with all the limitations that entails, and you will never be able to return home." Marcus realized what she was being asked to sacrifice. Her entire life, her family, her world, everything she'd ever known. "Nova, you can't. I won't let you give up everything for me." She reached across the table and took his hands, and for the first time since he'd known her, her skin felt genuinely warm, not the perfect 98.6 degrees of her alien physiology, but the fluctuating warmth of real human emotion. "Don't you understand?" she said. "You're not just someone I'm giving things up for. You're the reason I finally understand what it means to be alive." The holographic commander made a sound that might have been disgust or resignation. "Very well. You have made your choice. Biological. Transition will commence immediately. You find satisfaction in your ... humanity." The projection vanished, and with it, the electromagnetic interference that had been plaguing the campus. Suddenly, the library was quiet, except for the normal sounds of students and the hum of properly functioning electronics. Nova gasped and doubled over, her body convulsing as if every cell was being rewritten. Marcus caught her as she fell, feeling her skin grow warmer, her heartbeat become irregular, her breathing shift to the patterns of genuine human physiology. "Are you okay?" he asked, terrified. When she looked up at him, her amber eyes had dimmed to a more human shade of brown, but they were still the most beautiful eyes he'd ever seen. "I'm perfect," she whispered, "for the first time in my life. I'm exactly where I belong." As Marcus held Nova close, watching her become fully human in his arms. He realized that love really was the most powerful force in the universe, strong enough to bridge the gap between worlds, and worth any sacrifice. To protect. Eddie, the night janitor, was walking past their table when he paused and looked at them with knowing smile. "Young folks these days," he said cheerfully, "always making things more complicated than they need to be. Sometimes the best stories are about finding someone worth staying for." Marcus looked down at Nova, who was now genuinely shivering in the library's air conditioning, and smiled. "Would you like to borrow my jacket?" he asked. "I would love that," she replied, and for the first time, she wasn't pretending to be cold. She was just human, in love, and finally, completely honest. As they walked out of the library together, hand in hand, neither of them noticed the shooting star that streaked across the afternoon sky, a final farewell from a world that Nova had chosen to leave behind for something even more extraordinary, a love that was literally out of this world.